Good morning, everyone. It occurs to me that you might not all know who I am. I'm Adam. I'm one of the pastors here. I don't always recognize every face, so just in case you're a new face to me and I'm a new face to you, that's who I am. This morning, I'm continuing our summer series in the 7 deadly sins. And this morning, we're going to talk about wrath. And I think we use words like wrath and rage and anger just kind of interchangeably. This morning, that's close enough most of the time. This morning, I'm going to talk about anger probably more as like the emotional feeling, and wrath in this discussion is more like the habit of long-standing anger. It's kind of like wrath is what angry wants to be when it grows up, if that makes sense. Like anger's kind of the small, and it grows into wrath. Because anger isn't wrong in itself. It's an emotion that we feel. It's like feeling happy or sad. And I think I want to say that emotions are important. It's important to feel them. It's important to acknowledge them, and figure out how and why we're feeling. They're kind of like they're the indicator lights on the dashboard. It might not be the whole story, but it's telling you something's up, and you might want to explore that. Don't ignore your emotions. So, it feels a little bit like oversimplifying. Anger's okay, wrath is not. But that's kind of where we're headed today. It's like anger is when you hit your thumb with the hammer and you have that, oof. And it's not as far back as I thought. I almost went over. And then it passes, right? You're upset, but you can only really be mad at the hammer, and you're the one holding it, so, work through it. Let it go. Wrath is more like when you keep working on the anger, and you fan the flames and keep that anger hot, and eventually, you've got a burning rage for the Stanley Hammer Company. You daydream about going to the hammer factory and really taking care of business with whoever built that hammer, right? You've nurtured it. You've kind of held on, and something that was small has grown because of your attention. It's completely out of scale now. My point is, a lot of things that might be appropriate to feel angry about for the moment are disproportionate if you hang on to it. Several years ago, I had a work situation where one person made some big decisions that impacted a bunch of us in a pretty significant way. And for a long time, every time I thought about that person, I would instinctively also think, those actions really caused some problems for the rest of us. Always the same sentence, every time I thought of them. And it became ingrained. And one day I realized I had trained my brain so that every time I thought about that person, who I still consider to be a friend, every time I thought about them, I had substituted this angry sentence. So it kind of became their whole personality. It took up so much space in my head that I couldn't think about that person in any other way. I had summarized a whole person into a short and pretty unfair sentence. I had allowed my anger to blind me to the fact that they're still a real person with real struggles. My anger wasn't helpful to me, and it sure wasn't helpful in showing love to my friend. It's important to be aware of the anger and make sure it doesn't grow into a habit in your thinking. So, as a point of discussion, I feel like this is the other side of the coin. I guess this is what it looks like when you flip a coin. The other side of the coin, it can be useful to channel your anger. It can sometimes provide enough incentive to do something when something needs to be done, to take some action in a just cause. But I think it's important that the anger gets filtered through an idea like this one. Anger can only be properly directed at our own sin, never at a human being. Anger can never be properly directed at our... Oh, I screwed it up. Anger can only properly be directed at our own sin, never at a human being. This starts to feel tricky because I might feel, for example, perfectly justified in being angry and hateful towards drug dealers. They bring all kinds of pain and suffering into our communities. But if I agree with this slide, I can't allow my anger. I have to be mad at the drug trade, not at the drug dealers. Honestly, I don't want to agree with the slide. But I need to, if I want to be consistent with the Gospels, I need to love my neighbor. Jesus says that a few times, and he's pretty clear about it. It's a fundamental value. And he has answered the question, who is my neighbor? Right? So the answer is, yes, I need to love drug dealers. They absolutely are my neighbor. Jesus spends all kinds of time with people who are doing the wrong thing. He shows them love. Nurturing anger for a person cannot foster love. But I'm still mad about the drugs, so what do I do? One possibility is to channel that anger into something productive. There are organizations out there making positive change that I could be involved with. If I'm mad enough, I might start an organization of my own. If it's worth being mad about, it's probably worth doing something about it. That seems to be what's happening in John chapter 2, starting in verse 14. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and the cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then, going over to the people selling doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." The story of Jesus clearing the temple, I think, comes naturally to mind as a classic example of Jesus being angry. But as I was looking at it, I found it very interesting that he's not actually described as angry. We assume it and we interpret it that way, but it's very interesting that he's not. It doesn't use the word. There's a few words it could have used. He doesn't use any words for angry. So he just does it. John does say that he was overcome by zeal, which I don't think necessarily requires anger. Maybe he was. Doesn't actually say it. Try reading it as though he's calm and matter-of-fact, and the point still comes across. My grandpa had a special orange plastic pipe. So we had cattle, and Grandpa had a special piece of pipe. And if he needed to move cows from one area to another, he would carry his special pipe, and he would kind of yell at them. And he'd cowboys have, Grandpa wasn't a cowboy, but people working with cattle they call them funny names. Anyway, he might whap them on the rump to get them going, but was he angry at the cows? Like, I don't, maybe sometimes, but not as a matter of course. Like, it wasn't the stick of rage. It was just, I think it's possible to see the story without seeing Jesus as angry. And whether it's angry or not, it's not wrath. Wrath is essentially selfish. Wrath wants what's best for me, at the cost of whatever might happen to somebody else. Righteous anger is different from wrath in that it will always be in pursuit of justice. It will always be righting wrongs on behalf of the powerless. What if, instead of stoking my fire of anger in my soul when I encounter injustice, what if I turn instead to prayer and ask God, break my heart for what breaks yours? Turn the righteous anger into sorrow. If I'm able to see the world as God sees it, maybe I can do without the burden of wrath. If I can listen to the heart of God and participate in the situation and be part of the solution, whatever that might look like. There are a couple other passages in the Gospels I want to look at. The next one's in Mark, chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Jesus went into the synagogue again and noticed a man with a deformed hand. Since it was the Sabbath, Jesus' enemies watched him closely. If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand in front of everyone." And he turned to his critics and said, "Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save life or destroy it?" But they wouldn't answer him. He looked around at them angrily and was deeply saddened by their hard hearts. And he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. This is, as far as I can tell, one of the few times we see the word anger attributed directly to Jesus' state of mind. He looks around angrily at the Pharisees because they would rather follow the rules than show mercy through healing. One of the only times my sweet grandmother ever raised her voice was when we were kids and we were fighting, and she would say, "Be kind to one another." She was a little old lady, and it wasn't even that loud. She was a sweet little person, but as loud as she could make it, "Be kind to one another." I think be kind to one another is a better rule to follow, whether or not we work on the Sabbath. Showing love by meeting practical needs is a priority for Jesus. It captures the essence of his mission, which is to heal and to save. Sometimes we think of Jesus as a get-out-of-hell-free card. It's so very much more than that. It's an invitation to live with Jesus and do the work of the Father. To be a Christian means that I want to be more like Jesus. What do I learn from the passage about being like Jesus? For one thing, I think we see injustice should push my buttons. I don't want to look shiny and perfect if it has to come at the expense of someone else. That act of kindness should take priority over following the rules, the way the Pharisees do. Second, people shouldn't know me as an angry person. It's unusual for Jesus to be angry in Scripture. More often, he's described as a gentle shepherd. In fact, in verse 2, his enemies are already watching him because they know what to expect from this guy. He already has a reputation for healing and helping and doing something, even if, because they know, oh, it's Sabbath, this guy's got the broken hand, what's Jesus going to do? Let's watch, let's get him. Because he already has the reputation. He doesn't have a reputation for being angry, he has a reputation for being a gentle shepherd. Injustice may bring out my anger, but I don't want wrath to be one of my defining characteristics. Another story about Jesus being angry is in John chapter 11, beginning in verse 33. Jesus has arrived at the tomb of Lazarus, and he sees Mary crying. When Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. "Where have you put him?" he asked them. They told him, "Lord, come and see." Then Jesus wept. Those who were standing nearby said, "See how much he loved him." I think it's really interesting. In these two stories, we have three elements that are the same. The anger, the love, and the sadness are in both passages. And I think in both cases, it's an anger at injustice. It's also love that defines the reaction. I was at the funeral of a child once, and the pastor opened up with, "This is not how it's supposed to be." I think that's what makes Jesus so angry at the tomb. Knowing his friend is dead and how much pain his other friends are experiencing wells up in Jesus a sense of, this is not how it's supposed to be. Later in the story, Jesus shouts to call Lazarus out of the tomb. It's also unusual for Jesus to shout. We already know the story. Jesus was planning all along to come and to be there and to resurrect Lazarus. But at the moment, boots on the ground, Jesus feels this powerful emotion, and he turns his attention to putting things back to right. He directs his efforts into resolving the situation because of love and through an action of love. Jesus is defined by his love rather than his wrath. We have a book at our house called "I Was So Mad." And it's a kid's book, although I remember reading it to my kids, and it reminded me of when I was younger and how much I could actually relate to that book, because sometimes I was just so mad. And I mean, some of this is normal growing up. When you're a child, teenager, you're still learning what to do with these emotions and how to process them well. Some of that's normal, but I remember as I became older especially, so often I would be so mad because somebody injured my pride. I would go straight to rage, and I would sit on that rage for way too long. I remember, I would like to say this was solved by the time I was in kindergarten, but I remember one of my first jobs, my boss said to me one time, I don't know how it came up, but he said, "You sometimes carry a black mark for people, hey?" I was surprised. I'm like, "Ooh, I guess I know what you're talking about. I didn't realize that it was showing." But he could tell. Sometimes somebody had offended me. Maybe he'd even seen it happen. I was done with that person. I didn't want to talk to them again. His comment helped me start thinking about the inconsistency in my life, the contradiction between what I believed, which is I gotta love my neighbor. Did I mention I was working at a Bible college at the time? Right? So this part's not a surprise. I need to love my neighbor. I can't be mad at that guy. I can't nurture that anger for what that guy said to me that one time. Letting it grow into wrath puts me on a path I don't want to be traveling. I don't want to murder anyone, but that's the path I've started. Anger is the first step to murder. For Jesus, even more than for the Old Testament, wrath has the full gravity of sin. This judgment is shared by Paul and his followers. While to refrain from anger is to give place to God, anger can be giving a place to the devil. When Jesus is speaking to the crowd in Matthew chapter 5, and we'll go to Matthew chapter 5 next. After the Beatitudes, we have these "you have heard" statements. And he's helping us understand the difference between following the law and living the intent of the law. In example after example, Jesus clarifies topics like adultery or keeping vows or taking revenge or dealing with anger. Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. You have heard that our ancestors were told, "You must not murder. If you commit murder, you are subject to judgment. But I say, if you are even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. If you curse someone, you are in danger of the fires of hell." The law says, do not murder. But honestly, living life in a community with others, that's a pretty broad boundary. There's a surprising amount of wiggle room for, I could still hate the guy, I could maybe ruin his business, I can send some guys to break his knees. Like, as long as we don't murder him, we haven't broken that law. Jesus is saying no to all that. It's not enough to keep the external law. All these actions begin with a choice, a decision, a habit, the state of my own heart. Jesus is not abolishing the law. Like, yes, it's still against the law to murder. He's saying yes, and it starts in your heart. If you're holding wrath in your heart against anyone, it's really only a difference in degree between that wrath and murder. Ephesians 4, beginning in verse 26. These verses capture what I've been trying to get at. Verse 26 says, don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you are still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. To rephrase a little bit, anger is okay, but it becomes sin when you let it control you. Don't let anger be your guide. Feel it, acknowledge it, understand what it's trying to tell you, and then process it in a healthy way. Don't let it grow into wrath. Anger is not a commodity you want to save up and store. Do what you can to resolve the situation quickly. Ask yourself, is my anger helping in this situation? Usually not. More likely it's like in verse 27 here. And it's taking you down a path of destruction rather than a road to restoration. I mean, if you frequently find yourself super angry, if wrath is driving the bus, honestly, maybe talk to somebody about that. There's got to be you don't want to carry that around. We can't just erase anger and never feel it again, but don't right? Don't let it become a habit. Don't let wrath become your defining characteristic. And I mean, begin by asking yourself, is this something Jesus would be angry about? He gets angry about some things. The answer might be yes. Is this something Jesus is angry about? And then, if the answer is yes, ask yourself, how would Jesus resolve this situation with love and patience? May we all find ways to be like Jesus, choosing peace instead of wrath, and pursuing justice with love and mercy. I'm going to call the worship team to come as I conclude with prayer. Lord, we recognize that sometimes we get angry and it is the right choice, but sometimes we let anger burn too hot or for too long. Help us to see things from your perspective. Help us to choose to be like you in those moments. Grant us your peace as we seek to respond with love rather than wrath. Be with us, Lord, in difficult situations, and help us to be like you in those moments. Lead us on your paths, Lord, and continue to teach us to be more like you each day. Amen.